Migrants, a historical and psychological inquiry. Fear rarely introduces itself honestly. It does not say, I am fear. It arrives instead as a concern, a caution, as something that feels rational, even responsible. It enters conversations quietly through tone, through language, through the subtle shift that occurs when a topic moves from abstract to personal. Migration is one of those topics. At first, it appears in numbers, statistics, policy discussions, administrative language. But very quickly, something else takes hold. The conversation becomes charged. Words like pressure, strain, crisis begin to surface. What seemed like analysis becomes something more emotional, and beneath it all, often unspoken, but deeply present, is fear. It is tempting to believe that this fear is instinctive, that it emerges naturally when people encounter difference, that it belongs to biology rather than culture. But if that was true, but if that were true, it would be consistent. The same groups would be feared across time. The same reactions would appear in different places. The pattern would be stable. It is not. Different societies fear different people at different moments. Groups once seen as threats become accepted. Others take their place. The object of fear shifts, but the structure remains. This suggests something important. Fear is not only a reaction, fear is a process. Fear is shaped by context, by narrative, by repetition. Fear grows in environments where uncertainty is high and explanation is limited. Fear offers a way to make sense of change, even if that sense is incomplete or inaccurate. Migration sits at the center of this dynamic because it represents movement in a world that often seeks stability. It brings difference into spaces that define themselves through familiarity. It raises questions about belonging, identity, and control. And when these questions are not easily answered, fear becomes a substitute. When you think about migration, are you responding to people or to the ideas attached to people? Fear begins with perception, not with reality as it exists, but with reality as it is understood. And understanding is shaped by information, by what is seen, what is heard, and what is repeated. Human beings rely on patterns. We interpret the world by identifying recurring signals and using these to predict outcomes. When certain ideas are repeated often enough, they begin to feel true even in the absence of direct experience. This is particularly important in the context of migration. More people do not encounter, Most people do not encounter migration directly. They do not witness border crossings, asylum processes, or displacement firsthand. Instead, most people encounter migration through representation, through news, social media, and political discourse. This creates distance between experience and perception, and that distance is filled by narrative. According to the International Organization for Migration, people or public attitudes towards migrants are strongly influenced by how migration is framed. Language plays a central role in this process. Consider the difference between describing movement as an increase in arrivals versus movement as a surge at the border. The factual content may be similar, but the emotional effect is not. The second phrase, a surge at the border, suggests urgency, pressure, instability. It activates concern even before any analysis takes place. Over time, repeated exposure to such framing builds association. Migration becomes linked with crisis, with disruption, with risk. This does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. A headline here, a report there, a political speech, a social media post. Each instance reinforces the previous one. Eventually, the association becomes automatic. Migration equals threat. And once that association is established, new information is interpreted through it. Evidence that supports the narrative is amplified. Evidence that challenges the narrative is less visible. This is how perception stabilizes, not through direct experience, but through repetition. When you form an opinion about migration, how much of it comes from what you personally have seen, and how much from what you have been told? Historical development, fear across time. Fear of migrants is not new. It has appeared in different forms across history, attaching itself to different groups depending on context. In 19th century Europe, industrialization triggered large-scale internal migration. Rural populations moved to cities, urban environments expanded rapidly, established communities faced sudden change. This produced anxiety. Workers feared job competition. Residents feared overcrowding. Political leaders framed migration as a source of instability. Yet over time, these internal migrants became part of the urban population. What was once unfamiliar became normal. The fear did not disappear. The fear shifted. In the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, waves of immigration from Europe were met with suspicion. New arrivals were often described as incompatible with existing social structures. Laws were introduced to restrict entry, justified through arguments about national identity and economic protection. Again, over time, many of these groups became integrated. Their presence became unremarkable. Then the pattern repeated. In each case, the specific group changed, the language evolved, but the underlying structure remained. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, narratives surrounding displacement often reflect broader societal tensions. Migration becomes a way of expressing concerns that extend beyond movement itself. Economic insecurity, political instability, cultural change. Migrants became symbols, representations of these broader issues. This symbolic role is powerful because it simplifies complexity. Instead of confronting multiple interconnected problems, fear can be directed toward a visible group. But this simplification comes at a cost. It obscures underlying causes. It shifts focus away from structural issues. And it reinforces a cycle in which fear moves from one group to another without ever resolving the conditions that produce it. If the target of fear keeps changing, what remains constant? Media and narrative, reinforcement mechanisms. In contemporary society, media is the primary mechanism through which migration is understood. It determines what is visible, what is emphasized, what is repeated. Different forms of media construct different narratives. Some reporting situates migration within broader geopolitical context, linking it to conflict, economic inequality, and historical processes. This framing emphasizes cause and complexity. Other coverage focuses on policy, legal frameworks, administrative responses, political debate. This framing emphasizes governance. Other reporting emphasizes immediacy, images of crossings, crowded spaces, visible moments of arrival. This framing emphasizes urgency. Each approach highlights certain aspects while obscuring others, but what matters most is repetition. According to the International Organization for Migration, repeated exposure to specific frames influences perception. When migration is consistently associated with crisis, audiences begin to interpret migration through that lens, the lens of crisis. This does not require misinformation, it requires emphasis only, highlighting certain elements more frequently than others. Over time, the dominant narratives becomes familiar, and familiarity shapes interpretation. People begin to anticipate certain patterns. They expect migration to be associated with risk. They interpret new information accordingly. This creates a feedback loop. Media shapes perception. Perception influences political demand. Political responses reinforce media framing, and the cycle continues. Do you recognize the patterns in how migration is presented, or only the conclusions they lead to? The psychological dimensions, why fear persists. Fear persists because it serves a psychological function. It simplifies. Migration is complex. It involves economic systems, legal frameworks, historical processes, individual experiences. It cannot be reduced to a single explanation. But fear allows that complexity to be condensed and abolished. Instead of multiple causes, fear identifies a single source. Instead of uncertainty, fear provides clarity. This clarity is not necessarily accurate, but it is effective. Humans are uncomfortable with uncertainty. When outcomes are unclear, anxiety increases. Fear provides resolution by identifying a threat and suggesting a response. This is particularly relevant during periods of broader instability, economic shifts, political fragmentation, social change. In such contexts, migration becomes a focal point, not because it is the sole cause of these changes, but because migration is visible. Migration offers a tangible reference point for abstract concerns. Psychologically, this is efficient, but it can also be misleading because the focus on migration may obscure other factors, structural inequalities, policy decisions, historical processes that are all less visible but equally significant. Fear directs attention, and what receives attention shapes understanding. When fear simplifies a complex issue, what is left out? Well, the counter argument is engaging reality. It is important to acknowledge that migration can present real challenges. Rapid population changes can affect housing, infrastructure, and public services. Integration requires sources. Policy decisions have consequences. These concerns are all valid. Ignoring them would be incomplete. But the presence of challenge does not justify the amplification of fear. The issue is not whether migration should be discussed, it is how it is framed. When perception becomes disproportionate, when isolated incidents are generalized, when narrative replaces analysis, fear begins to shape policy in ways that may not address underlying issues. Policies driven primarily by fear tend to prioritize control over understanding, restriction over adaptation. They may provide short-term reassurance, these policies, but they often fail to resolve long-term challenges. A more effective approach requires proportionality. A more effective approach requires proportionality. Understanding scale, recognizing variation, distinguishing between perception and evidence. This does not eliminate disagreement, but it changes the basis on which decisions are made. Are policies responding to reality, or are policies responding to the perception of reality? What does fear reveal? Fear of migration reveals more about the societies experiencing it than about migrants themselves. It reflects underlying tensions, economic inequality, political uncertainty, questions of identity. Migration becomes a lens through which these tensions are expressed. According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, public attitude towards migration are shaped by context, media, policy, and historical memory. This means that fear is not fixed. Fear evolves, fear adapts. And because fear is shaped, fear can also be reshaped. Understanding fear as a process rather than a reaction changes how fear is addressed. Fear becomes something to analyze rather than accept, something to question rather than assume. This does not eliminate fear, but it phrases it within a framework. And that framework allows for critical engagement. A word repeated, an image shown again, a story told until it settles into place. Fear builds quietly, not in a single moment, but over time until it feels natural, obvious, inevitable. And yet, fear was constructed, layer by layer, frame by frame. And once that becomes visible, fear changes. Fear becomes something else, not just a reaction, but a question. Fear of migrants is shaped by history, media, and psychological processes. It reflects broader societal tensions and is constructed through narrative rather than being purely instinctive. Take a moment to reflect. Is your perception shaped by experience or by repetition?